Hi to everyone who is logged into today's webinar. We have a high volume of attendees joining us today, so I'm just going to leave another minute to let as many people join as possible, and then we'll get cracking. Okay, so I think we'll get started now. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and thanks for joining. Welcome to today's Emsi webinar, where I'm going to talk about 3 ways in which we can help you to demonstrate the value of your apprenticeships. And here's what we'll cover off today. If you do have any questions at any stage, then please do type those questions into the drop-down box in your control panel, the questions drop-down box, and I'll either answer them as we go or I'll wait until the end. And once we have completed today's webinar, everyone will receive the slides and a follow-up from myself. So to begin with, a quick hello from us at Emsi and an introduction to those of you who don't know us. Our mission is to provide robust and reliable and understandable data insights so that our clients in various markets can make better, more informed decisions. In the UK, the FE market has long been our most populous, and we continue to love working with colleges in all areas of the UK to solve problems across a wide array of issues. And when it comes to evidencing economic impact, or the impact of provision, that's actually the first thing that Emsi ever did when we were established in the US almost 20 years ago. And since then, we've delivered hundreds of economic impact analysis right around the world in a high volume here in the UK. We're in National Apprenticeship Week right now, so it's obviously timely to be talking about demonstrating the value of apprenticeships. And also, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the changes to the apprenticeship landscape that have occurred in recent times, whether that be the introduction of the levy, associated tendering for provision, increased competition, etc. And most recently, we've seen Ofsted looking very closely at the impact of provision across all providers and also the relevance of provision. And those things are really timely, and of course, what we're going to touch on a little bit today. And in the external environment, just this week, we've seen a report released from the National Audit Office into the apprenticeship programme. Pretty interesting findings, not necessarily anything that most of us didn't already know or weren't already aware of, but an interesting report nonetheless, and evidence that the apprenticeship programme is being looked at very closely within government. And two things in particular jumped out at me when I read the report and I was thinking about today's webinar. Firstly, a reminder that a huge amount of funding remains on the table, whatever your viewpoint on the levy and how that's working and how it impacts on providers and non-levy paying employers. There's still a huge amount of funding and monies that are floating around, and there's an opportunity there for colleges and providers to do more, deliver more apprenticeships, of course with challenges. And secondly, what jumped out from this latest report is that there are still questions about the impact that apprenticeships have on the economy, and productivity was specifically mentioned in the report. And interestingly, that is absolutely one of the things that our analysis can help you to do, to demonstrate the impact that your apprentices and your apprenticeships are having on productivity in your local economy. And we'll come to that later on. Now, within the sector itself, we've been doing a lot of work at Emsi on apprenticeships, as you can imagine, over the past 12 months and beyond. And in my conversations with principals and chief execs, these, if not all of these things, will be familiar to you. What I thought was interesting, again, when I was preparing today's webinar slides, was a high proportion of these issues that principals and chief execs are talking about can be helped by having the ability to demonstrate and really shout about the value that your apprenticeships provide. And that's why we are here, and that's why we are hoping to help you out with that. So let's get into it then. 3 ways to demonstrate the value of apprenticeships. Now, the first that I'm going to touch on is how we can calculate and report on return on investment. So when it comes to employers and funding bodies and others, what do they get back from the investment that they make in apprenticeships? Now, we can measure this by running an investment analysis, which is a concept that you will all be familiar with. We put some money into something. If we get more out at some point, then that's a good thing. But if we put money into something and lose money, that's not such a good thing. That's an investment analysis, and we can run that for the apprenticeship provision that you guys have. For apprenticeships in particular, we can run that analysis and look at return on investment for employers and apprentices themselves and funding bodies. But if we think, as an example, about employers, so what's the return on investment to employers? Firstly, we need to think about the costs. So what are the true costs to employers? Well, that's really a mixture of the obvious, so any fee that they pay, or in recent times, any levy, if they're a levy paying employer. And then some less obvious things, perhaps like what are the actual wages that they have to pay to apprentices? What's the financial cost to the employer of the time they spend supporting and mentoring their apprentices by releasing managers or other support staff to mentor and work with the apprentice? What's the actual cost there? So that's the kind of analysis that we run. We look at very detailed modelling of the true costs to the employer, and then we can start to think about what is it that employers get back. So what is the benefit to the employer in particular for the time and the cost that they have spent through the apprenticeship period? Well, simply put, training costs and time spent by the employer decrease over time during an apprenticeship, and at the same time, the productivity and output associated with the apprentice or apprentices increases. And these are things we can measure, we can tangibly measure, and we can tangibly talk about, specific to your provision at your college or at your provider. So initially, when we run the numbers, the costs outweigh the benefits because of those true costs that we saw earlier on. But in time, we find that benefits start to tip the balance and end up outweighing the cost. And we can put pounds and pence figures on that. So we can track how productive apprentices become over time, which will of course differ between sectors. We can track wages specific to your local region. Initially, they will be less than a typical full-time worker, but apprentices are actually often deployed to output critical tasks. Depending again on the sector, those tasks will differ. We will model all of this, and we will model the productivity gains and the impact on the output of that employer that apprentices are having. Again, that will depend on which sector they're working in. Talk to specific employers, or include in your bids or your response to competitive tenders, specific return on investment figures for your own provision, for your own specific college or your own specific institution. Pretty powerful stuff. The second way that we can think and talk about demonstrating the value of apprenticeships is by looking at earnings potential and what apprentices themselves get out of being an apprentice and going through the apprenticeship process. Useful for engagement with potential apprentices in the future, existing apprentices, and perhaps parents and other influencers. And when we're doing this type of analysis, what we run is something called an economic growth analysis, which is essentially looking at the impact that your provision has on earnings and productivity within the local economy. And we can dig right down into apprenticeships, particularly, and run that analysis to see the detailed, granular impacts that your apprenticeship provision is having on earnings and productivity within your employer partners. So that covers these things. Apprenticeships are contributing to earnings growth over time, which means a higher local spend by those apprentices, higher productivity amongst their employers, which then generates what we call multiplier effects, where more money is spent, more productivity, and more employment, etc., more local spend and more local economic activity. And when we're thinking about earnings in particular, we again look specifically at your provision. So wages will differ in different parts of the country, and we model all of that. Employment rates now and in the future, and in the past, will differ between different regions of the UK. We model all of that. And the follow-on impact of what apprentices earn and spend, again, will differ depending on where you are in the country. There are unique spending patterns and multiplier effects that are specific to your area. And what we find with apprentices is that wages are initially low if we compare it to an equivalent full-time job, but there's a medium-term premium in the fact that apprentices become relatively highly skilled in a relatively short time period, and their wages are typically reflected in that, so that we can track all of that through, and then can, again, specific to your college or your provider and specific to your region, we can dig down to average wage levels specific to apprentices at different levels, of course. And again, we can talk about return on investment to apprentices as well, and be able to explain to individual apprentices and their influencers that what they have to give up, perhaps in the short term, is more than outweighed by future wages and future wage potential and future spending potential as well. Now, the third way that we can talk about the value and the impact of apprenticeships is by considering the relevance and importance of your apprenticeship provision. And we can do this both from the local labour need perspective. So are your apprentices, are the apprenticeships that you are offering matching up with what your local and regional economy actually needs? And we can also look and measure at how important your provision is in creating economic value. So firstly, if we think about some fairly traditional labour market data, this can actually help us to understand how relevant and needed your provision is, which is absolutely something that Ofsted is looking at right now. If we think, to begin with, from an industry perspective, if we think about an industry and what is happening within that industry, it can tell us about how relevant our apprenticeships are, or perhaps can tell us where we might have an opportunity to deliver new apprenticeships. If we use an example here, we'll look at two different regions, northeast and northwest of the UK, and the time period is the last full year, and looking forward a couple of years. And I've picked an industry which is in the news right now, so the manufacturing of rolling stock, which is basically the manufacturing of trains and support equipment. Now, that industry has a lot of jobs within it, both the obvious, so kind of engineering type jobs, but also a lot of design jobs, also a lot of sales and marketing jobs as well. But if we look at how a particular industry is trending from a job perspective in those two regions, we see quite a big difference. So there's big growth in the northeast, largely around Hitachi developments up there and Siemens developments, but there's actually contraction in the northwest. Now, I'm not suggesting that these jobs are all apprenticeships, but it's giving you an industry overview and a guide towards how that industry is trending and how therefore relevant apprenticeships might be in that particular industry, or might be to that particular industry. So do you measure your provision against industry trends? Is that something you do for your apprenticeships? Is it something you do for your other provision? This is something we do a lot of with colleges for both apprenticeships and other provision. We can then kind of take that a step further and deeper, and we can look at individual jobs. So we first looked at an industry as a whole. Now we can look at a job or an occupation again and think about how that will guide us as to whether apprenticeships in these particular occupations or leading to these particular occupations are a safe bet. Again, we'll pick two regions, two slightly different regions this time, so northeast and southwest. So a big shout out to the northeast on today's webinar. And if we, again, same time period, if we look at a particular occupation, in this case care home workers, and we know from our work with the sector that this particular occupation offers potential for apprenticeships, both a direct route and also as a kind of progression from an apprenticeship into a higher level position as a care home worker. Again, we can see that in overall terms this time, not percentages, but in overall terms, big growth in care home workers in the northeast in the next couple of years, but actually a significant reduction and a contraction in the southwest for that very same job. Again, the question would be, are you aware of these occupational trends when you plan your apprenticeships? Are you fully aware of these trends when you are writing your bids and engaging with employers and other funding bodies? Again, something we are very, very well versed in, and something that we can help you to understand and help you to demonstrate. The other aspect of looking at relevance and impact is by measuring the actual impact on economic output that your apprenticeship provision has, both in the present but also based on your past provision, your historic provision. That's really important, because if we think about it, a significant percentage of your historic apprentices will still be economically active in your regional economy. Of course, not all of them will be, and not all of them will be working in jobs related to their apprenticeship, but a significant proportion will be. We can model that and measure the impact that historic provision has on things like employment rates, earning potential, productivity, local spend, etc., etc. Again, which is all different depending on where you are in the country and depending on your mix of apprenticeship provision, which sectors you serve, how that's changed over time, etc. So we can run all of that analysis and help you put a monetary value on the economic output associated with your apprenticeship provision right now and historically. So if we bring those things together, we can see some interesting findings and some interesting metrics. And if, for example, Ofsted come knocking, which they always do, it allows you to really shout about the particular value of your apprentices from the perspective of apprentices themselves, from the perspective of business or employers, and from the perspective of the economic impact and relevance that your provision is having. And clients who we're working with right now are telling us about Ofsted asking this type of questions, and we are here and ready to help you to answer those questions. And hopefully that content that I've run through there for the 3 different approaches has given you some food for thought. Now, whilst I just checked on any questions that have came in, I'll take this opportunity to mention our upcoming UK National Conference, which is happening in Birmingham, 15th and 16th of May. Check our website for more information on that. It's going to be a fantastic day, and we'd love to see you there. So I have a couple of questions that have came in since the last time I looked. One is, how can I access the analysis, and how long does it take? That's a great question. The first part of that answer is drop me a line. My details will appear shortly, and I'll be reaching out to everyone after this webinar. How long it takes, from experience, the apprenticeship specific analysis can take anywhere between 6 weeks and 12 weeks on average. And the second question that I haven't answered is, do we have examples of colleges who have had this analysis, and can you share more detail? Again, yes. We have a number of colleges who have undertaken this analysis already, and whilst I can't share their specific findings for understandable reasons of commercial sensitivity, we have some anonymized example studies that we would be delighted to share. So that's it for today. I hope it's been useful. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. thanks for taking the time to join us. As I mentioned, and I have mentioned a couple of times, I'll reach out to everyone with some supplementary material, and would love to talk to you more about helping you out with this kind of analysis, and hopefully can pick those conversations up with you shortly. Thanks for your time this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.